The last time I walked through the door of my childhood home in Charleston, South Carolina, I had no idea it would be the night that redefined everything I thought I knew about family. I remember the color of the sky as I pulled into the driveway. A dusky orange, fading into deep blue, the kind that should have felt peaceful, familiar, but something felt off. The house was the same. The porch light still flickered like it always had. The flower beds were still trimmed by Mom's careful hands. But that evening, the quiet wasn't comforting. It was sharp, like the moment before a storm breaks. Inside, the aroma of rosemary chicken and honey-glazed carrots wrapped around me like a memory. My mother, Teresa, smiled tightly and kissed my cheek. My father, Ronald, nodded from the kitchen. My brothers, Eli and Caleb, were already seated at the table, laughing too loudly at something neither of them would remember 5 minutes later. I set down my bag and took a breath. I told myself this was just dinner, a visit, routine. But the way my parents exchanged glances across the room, how Eli smirked when he saw me, and how Caleb barely looked up from his phone, it all felt rehearsed. As if they had already practiced whatever they were about to say, and I was just the final piece walking into place. We sat, we ate. Conversations floated around the table, Eli's new job he already hated, Caleb's latest project, which sounded more like a dream than a plan. My parents nodded, encouraged, laughed at the right times. When I mentioned closing a high-profile client in Seattle, the room went quiet for just a beat too long, before Mom smiled and said, "That's nice, dear." And then, somewhere between dessert and that second glass of wine I didn't want, my mother cleared her throat. "There's something important we'd like to share," she said, gently laying down her fork, as though placing it delicately would make what followed any less devastating. My father added, "We finalized our will." I paused, the fork in my hand frozen in midair. "Okay." Eli leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confidence blooming on his face. "Long story short, everything's going to Caleb and me." I laughed, because surely that had to be a joke. But Caleb just looked at me, nodded, and took another bite of his pie. I looked to my parents, searching their faces for some reaction. Disbelief, correction, even embarrassment. But there was only quiet acceptance. My mother said, "You've done well for yourself, Isla. You don't need our support. Your brothers are still finding their way." "Support?" I repeated. "Are you serious?" My father cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. For years, over a decade, I had helped pay this mortgage. I had sent Caleb money when he couldn't pay rent. I covered Eli's out-of-pocket surgery bill. When Mom got sick and insurance didn't cover the treatments, I cashed out my savings. My 20s disappeared in the form of wiring money home and saying no to myself so they could say yes. And now, I was being told I'd get nothing. Not because they didn't have enough, but because they believed I didn't need anything. Because I had survived without their help. So after everything I've done, I don't deserve to be part of this? "You always make things about money," my mother snapped. "It's not about money," I said, my voice shaking. "It's about being seen." Eli laughed under his breath. "No one asked you to help. That was your choice." Caleb leaned forward. "Maybe you thought if you did enough, you'd finally be the favorite." I looked to my parents. Nothing. Not a word to stop them. Not a single attempt to defend me. I stood up slowly. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice calm. "You've made your decision. Now let me make mine. From now on, don't expect anything from me." And I walked out. No one followed me to the door. Not even Mom. Not even a whisper of hesitation. Outside, the world was quiet. No dramatic thunder, no cinematic rain. Just the soft chirp of crickets and the distant rumble of cars along the street. But inside, something seismic had shifted. As I drove back towards Seattle mile by mile, the weight I had carried for so long of obligation, expectation, guilt began to crack and crumble. I hadn't realized how much I had been giving until I was told, to my face, that it meant nothing. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw what I could give. And when I stopped giving, I stopped being of value to them. Back at my apartment, I sat in the dark, the skyline glowing through the windows. I opened my banking app, found the recurring transfers to my parents, Eli and Caleb. Thousands of dollars a month. Quiet, consistent help. A lifeline no one asked for, but no one ever turned down. I pressed cancel. The confirmation message blinked on the screen. Recurring payments successfully stopped. For a moment, I felt everything at once. Rage, betrayal, sorrow. But under all that, a quiet freedom. Not peace. Not yet. But the possibility of peace. The first breath of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced through memories. Eli crying on the phone when he couldn't pay his medical bill. Caleb swearing his startup would succeed if he could just get one more loan. My parents thanking me with tight smiles and quick hugs, always assuming I'd be there. And I was. Every time. Until now. This wasn't just about a will. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition. It was about being valued not for what I could do, but for who I was. But that wasn't what I had. What I had was silence from the people who claimed to love me. And that's where the story begins. Not with heartbreak, but with awakening. If this story moves something in you, if you've ever felt like your worth was measured only by what you could give, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the fuel to keep telling stories that matter, stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Before we continue, I want to hear your thoughts. Imagine you were in my shoes, sitting at that dinner table, hearing that your family was leaving you out of the will after years of financial and emotional support. Would you A, stay and keep helping, hoping they'll one day realize your worth? B, walk away and start choosing yourself for the first time? Let us know in the comments by typing your answer, A or B. We read every one and your voice matters here. Now, let's go back to that night after the dinner, because what came next changed everything. The drive back to Seattle felt longer than usual, the roads blurred, not from the rain that slicked the windshield, but from the way my mind kept replaying every word of that dinner. Eli's smug declaration, Caleb's quiet confirmation, and my parents' silence. It didn't feel like a family meeting. It felt like a sentencing. Me, cut out of their legacy, stripped of the role I'd played my entire adult life. When I reached my apartment, I dropped my bag and sat on the floor. The lights remained off. I didn't want clarity, not yet. I wanted to sit in the shadows of what I had just learned and let the numbness do what it does best, shield me from the pain waiting to rush in. Eventually I stood, changed into sweatpants, made tea I didn't drink, and opened my banking app. It had been muscle memory for years. Every month, $1,500 went to my parents' mortgage and household expenses. Another $700 was split between Caleb and Eli. One for Caleb's ever-changing business pursuits, one for Eli's revolving door emergencies, credit card debt, medical bills, rent shortfalls. I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the controls. There were no fireworks in my chest, no final dramatic decision, just a quiet, necessary truth whispering in the dark. You don't have to do this anymore. I clicked, canceled each one by one, like pulling the last stitches of a wound that had never closed properly. No more quiet withdrawals, no more silent sacrifices. When the last transfer disappeared, I set the phone down and waited to feel guilty. But I didn't. Not yet. What I felt was something entirely unfamiliar. The stillness after a storm. The moment your body realizes it doesn't have to keep bracing anymore. But still I didn't sleep. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. My mind, always calculating, always prepared, began to tally up a decade of sacrifices. The tuition bills I'd covered for Eli when he dropped out the third time. The cash I wired to Caleb when his wellness retreat startup fell apart. The down payment I gave up so Mom and Dad could renovate the house. I wasn't keeping score out of bitterness. I was doing it to finally see it clearly. I had always told myself it was love. That helping was what good daughters did. That someday it would all come back. Not in money, but in love, in gratitude, in the quiet pride of being the backbone of something. I was wrong. At 8:12 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Did you forget the mortgage payment? It didn't come through. 4 minutes later, a second text. Let me know if there's a problem. I didn't answer. At 9:30, the calls began. First Mom, then Eli, then Caleb, then back to Mom. By noon, I'd received 23 missed calls and 4 voicemails. I didn't answer any of them. At 1:17 p.m., a new voicemail came in. My mother's voice was sharp, edged with a type of calm fury she only used when deeply disappointed. Isla, I don't understand what's gotten into you. This isn't like you. We rely on that money. Your father and I have bills. Your brothers are struggling. Please don't let pride ruin this family. I played it 3 times. Not once did she ask why. Not once did she mention what they had done. To her, this was a tantrum, an inconvenience, not a breaking point, and suddenly I felt the sting of the truth I had refused to see for years. They had never seen me as someone with limits. That evening, I joined a virtual support circle for adult children of toxic families. I had found the group months earlier, but never had the courage to attend. This time, I showed up. I didn't speak right away, I just listened. Stories echoed through my headphones of emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, guilt tactics masquerading as love. Every sentence hit home, and then toward the end, a woman named Carla said something that stayed with me. We don't break because we're weak, we break because we keep carrying what no one else will. When the meeting ended, I sat in silence, tears finally sliding down my face. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time in years, I felt seen. That weekend, I drove out to a small cabin 2 hours outside the city. No cell service, no internet. Just solitude. I brought nothing but food, notebooks, and the books I hadn't touched in years. I wrote letters I never intended to send. To my parents, to Eli, to Caleb, to myself at 23, 26, 30. Letters filled with all the things I had swallowed to keep the peace. In one of those letters I wrote, I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought being needed meant being loved. But I was wrong. You didn't love me. You loved my usefulness. When I returned to the city, I found my mailbox filled with envelopes from home. Some were utility bills forwarded from my parents. One was a handwritten letter from Eli, short and sarcastic. Hope it feels good to let everyone down. Must be nice having that luxury. I didn't open the rest. On Monday, I went to work as usual. My assistant asked if everything was okay. I said yes, and it was the first time in a long time that I meant it. That afternoon, I made a decision. I would take my first real vacation in years. A trip not driven by obligation, guilt, or convenience, but one for me. A place I had dreamed of since I was a teenager, sketching cherry blossoms in the margins of my homework. Kyoto. I booked a flight for 2 months later. Just the act of booking it felt like rebellion, like defiance, like freedom. I marked the departure date on my calendar in bold red ink. Weeks passed. I stopped answering my family's calls altogether. When Caleb texted asking for money because he had an amazing investment opportunity, I didn't even open the message. I archived it with the rest. In therapy, I talked about the wound of being the dependable one, the one no one asked if they were tired, the one expected to catch everyone else but never allowed to fall. My therapist looked at me and said, "You were parentified. You weren't raised. You were recruited." The words hit like thunder. I wasn't the daughter. I was the fixer, the provider, the safety net. And now that I had cut the ropes, they were angry not because they missed me, but because they missed what I gave them. One evening, as I sat on my apartment balcony watching the skyline shift from day to night, I realized something quietly monumental. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I didn't need to defend my boundaries. Choosing myself didn't make me cruel. It made me free. A week before my flight to Kyoto, a package arrived at my door. No note, just a box. Inside was a photo album, old pictures. Me at 8, holding Caleb's hand on his first day of school. Me at 16, standing with Eli at his middle school graduation. Me at 25, next to my mother in the hospital after her surgery. Moments I had almost forgotten, now staring back at me. It was meant to guilt me. I knew that. A reminder of everything I'd been part of. A silent plea to remember what I was walking away from. But as I turned each page, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt clarity. I had been there for every milestone. I had shown up, given, supported, carried. And now I was choosing to stop. Not out of vengeance, but out of love for myself. Because love, real love, is not currency. It's not a transaction. And it's certainly not conditional on how much you sacrifice. And for the first time in my life, I was learning how to love myself the way I had tried to love them. And so I closed the photo album, placed it gently back in the box, and returned to my packing list for Japan. I was ready to leave the country. But more importantly, I was ready to leave behind the version of me who thought being loved meant being used. The version of me who never said no. The version who believed that being exhausted was proof of being good. I had paid my debt to my family 100 times over, and now I was finally learning to invest in someone I had overlooked for far too long, me. It began with a subtle exclusion. A birthday post from my mother on Facebook featuring only Eli and Caleb, captioned, "Proud of my boys, our future." No mention of me, no old photos, not even a passive-aggressive tag. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, but I knew better. I didn't respond. I didn't even let myself feel the sting. I just scrolled past it like I would a stranger's feed. But then came the real strike. A public post written in her signature faux humble tone, filled with carefully curated sadness. "Our family is going through something difficult," it read. "We never expected our oldest daughter to turn her back on us in our time of need. After all we've done, the sacrifices we've made, she's chosen distance. We're heartbroken." Below were photos of my parents standing outside the family home, my mother's eyes red from tears. Comments poured in. People I hadn't seen in years offered sympathy. Distant relatives chimed in with phrases like, "She always seemed cold," or "Some people let success go to their heads." It was a story, carefully crafted, publicly played out, and I was cast as the villain. The daughter who had abandoned the people who raised her, who forgot her roots, who let her career eclipse her compassion. Still, I said nothing. Until the door. It was a Monday evening. I had just returned from work, my mind still buzzing with budget projections and client emails, but something about my front door stopped me in my tracks. A thick layer of gray foam, dense and hardened like concrete, covered the entire door frame. The key wouldn't turn. The handle wouldn't move. My entrance to my own home had been sealed shut. At first, I stood there in disbelief. This had to be a mistake. A city maintenance error. Some kind of construction mix-up. But deep down, I already knew. I turned and walked calmly to the building's security office. The manager pulled up the camera footage from a few hours earlier, and there he was, Caleb. Hoodie pulled low, baseball cap shielding his face, but unmistakable in his gait, his posture, the way he looked around before raising the industrial spray can to my door. I watched him vandalize my home with the same easy confidence he used to ask for money. The officer who arrived didn't hesitate. "Would you like to press charges?" he asked after viewing the footage. I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely." The next morning, the calls came fast. First Eli, then my father, then finally my mother, whose voice was a mixture of outrage and wounded pride. "How could you turn your brother in?" He was upset. He made a mistake. "He vandalized my property, Mom," I said calmly, "and he did it because he couldn't control me anymore. This is going to tear the family apart." "No, Mom," I replied. "That already happened." Later that afternoon, I received a bank transfer. $3,000 from Eli with a note attached. "Here's your blood money. Never speak to us again." I stared at the message for a long time, waiting for the sadness to come. But I felt nothing. Not anger, not victory. Just a clear, resounding certainty. They never wanted me. They just wanted my resources. I opened my laptop, logged onto Facebook, opened a blank status box. For 10 years, I began, I've paid my parents' mortgage, my brother's tuition, medical bills, and business losses. Not because I was asked, but because I believed it meant love. I thought helping meant belonging. I wrote for nearly 30 minutes, my fingers moving as if powered by something deeper than thought. I detailed the money, the late-night calls, the birthdays missed because I was working overtime to send money back home. I included the footage of my door being vandalized. I included every financial record I could share without breaching personal security. I told the truth, not in anger, not in vengeance, but because I had been erased and I wanted to reclaim my name. Then I hit post. Within hours, it spread. Friends I hadn't heard from in years messaged me in shock. Several distant cousins reached out to say they had never known. One aunt, who I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, messaged, "I always suspected, but I didn't have the words. Thank you for telling the truth." But the strongest responses came from strangers. Women from around the country shared my post, commenting on how it mirrored their own hidden stories of being the reliable one, the sacrificial one, the one who was never seen. The silence from my immediate family was sudden and complete. No calls, no texts, nothing. For a while, I wondered if they were regrouping, planning another narrative, but nothing came. And in that silence, something began to bloom. I took long walks in the city at night, headphones off, letting the rhythm of my own thoughts finally emerge without interruption. I returned to the yoga studio I used to visit before the obligations piled too high. I started sleeping through the night. I started dreaming again. One evening after dinner, I received a message from a high school friend I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. "Thank you for writing what so many of us feel and never say. I shared your post with my sisters. We cried. You're not alone." It was strange. All my life, I had been quietly sacrificing for a family who made me feel invisible, and now strangers were reminding me of my worth. A week later, I received another message from someone unexpected. "Caleb, I messed up," it read. I was angry. I didn't think you'd really cut us off. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't respond. 2 days later, another one came from my father. "This is getting out of hand. Your mother can't leave the house without people asking questions. Why would you humiliate us like this?" Humiliation, not accountability, not apology. I typed out a single sentence. I told the truth. Then I hit send. The next day I was tagged in a response post written by my mother. It was longer this time, angrier, dressed up in careful language about hurt feelings and misunderstood intentions. But it wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a campaign. Comments flooded in again. Some supportive, some vicious. But I didn't post again. I didn't need to. I had said what I needed to say. The story was out, and the world didn't collapse. Instead, my world began to rebuild, one brick at a time. That week, I gave a talk at a local women's leadership circle about financial boundaries and burnout. I didn't mention my family. I didn't have to. I just spoke about value, about not setting yourself on fire to keep others warm. At the end, a young woman approached me. "How did you know it was time to walk away?" she asked. "I didn't," I said. "I just knew it hurt more to stay." That night back home, I lit a candle and journaled for the first time in weeks. Not about the past, but about what I wanted moving forward. Space. Truth. Connection not built on transaction, but mutual care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeking approval. I was creating peace. And I knew, deep in my bones, I would never beg for belonging again. Whatever came next, whether it was silence or confrontation or even reconciliation, would be met by a version of me who had finally chosen herself. And that was a version worth keeping. Spring arrived in Seattle like a whisper. The rain softened, the cherry blossoms bloomed along the streets in pink bursts of defiance against the gray, and something inside me began to thaw. It had been nearly 3 months since I posted my truth, since the final thread between me and my family had been cut. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's needs. I was just living. At work, I was sharper, lighter. I wasn't dragging invisible anchors into meetings. I restructured 3 major client portfolios in record time, earning not just a promotion to Director of Strategy, but something much rarer, genuine respect. My colleagues stopped viewing me as the reliable one who never said no and began treating me like the leader I had quietly become. But the deeper changes weren't on the surface. They were internal, like tectonic shifts you only feel when the ground finally stops shaking. I started therapy. A real commitment, not just bi-weekly check-ins, but hard, uncomfortable sessions where I unspooled the truth I had kept wrapped tight since I was a teenager. My therapist was a woman named Lila, calm, direct, and unflinchingly kind. In one session, she asked me, "What would your life look like if no one needed you?" I blinked, stunned by the question. For so long, my identity had been tied to being needed. Without that role, I didn't know who I was. But as the weeks passed, I began to find out. I started taking early morning walks without checking my phone. I cooked for pleasure, not necessity. I joined a group of women in finance who gathered once a month over wine to talk about leadership, money, and boundaries. We called ourselves the Ledger Circle. It wasn't just networking, it was kinship, built not on shared blood, but shared purpose. And then, one quiet Saturday morning, I sat at my kitchen table sipping green tea and staring at a tab I had opened weeks ago but never completed. It was a flight search to Japan, Kyoto, a place I had dreamed about for years. The temples, the calm, the philosophy of stillness. I had promised myself that when I was finally free, truly free, I would go. So I booked it. A month away. No work, no guilt, no obligations. When I landed, the air felt different. Not just in temperature, but in texture. There was reverence in the quiet of Kyoto's mornings. The narrow alleyways, the hum of bicycles, the rhythm of a culture built on intention and grace. I wandered aimlessly through Nishiki Market, tasted flavors I couldn't name, knelt in temples older than my entire country, and for the first time in years, I was still. One afternoon, I found myself in a tiny cafe tucked between 2 bookstores. The walls were lined with hand-painted scrolls, and the scent of roasted matcha lingered in the air. That's where I met him, Kenji. He was sketching on a napkin, a little architectural rendering of a temple he had seen that morning. He looked up and smiled. "You like this place too?" I nodded. "Feels like it's been waiting for me." He chuckled. "That's Kyoto. Quiet until it knows your name." He introduced himself. Half Japanese, half American, raised in Boston, now living between continents. An architect with a passion for form, light, and space. We spoke for hours about design, silence, and the strange weight of carrying things no one else sees. He never asked me about my job or my family. He didn't try to dig beneath the surface. He just sat with me, listened, offered pieces of himself gently. Over the next 2 weeks, we met often. No labels, no expectations. We visited shrines at sunrise, wandered through moss gardens, sat on rooftops drinking warm sake. With Kenji, I was just Isla, not the helper, not the strategist, not the sister or daughter, just a woman rediscovering herself layer by layer. One evening, we sat on the banks of the Kamo River as the city lights flickered on around us. He turned to me and asked, "What do you want next?" I didn't hesitate. A life where I belonged to myself. When I returned to Seattle, I brought more than souvenirs. I brought space. I rearranged my apartment, moved my desk near the window, added plants, removed everything that reminded me of what I used to carry. I even adopted a dog, a quiet little rescue named Nori, who followed me from room to room like a shadow. But the biggest change came from a new idea that had been forming quietly in my heart. I started a mentorship program called Balance Forward. It was born from everything I'd learned the hard way: financial literacy, emotional boundaries, generational pressure. It was for young women just starting out in finance, especially those from families like mine. We didn't just talk budgets and stocks. We talked burnout, guilt, and choosing ourselves. The first session was held in a rented co-working space downtown. I expected 5 women. 14 showed up. By the 3rd month, we had a waiting list. During one of our sessions, a young woman named Dana shared her story about covering her parents' rent while still paying off student loans. She broke down halfway through. When she looked up, I saw the same expression I had seen in the mirror for years, shame disguised as strength. I sat beside her, took her hand, and said, "You don't have to earn your place in your family. You already have it." That moment changed something in me too. I realized healing isn't just about walking away. It's about reaching back, offering a rope, a bridge, a voice to those still inside the burning house. Balance Forward became my passion project. I began speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, partnering with nonprofits. Not for validation, but because I finally had something to say. One night I received an email from Kenji. A photo of a temple at dusk, captioned, "The world misses you." I do too. I smiled. Not with longing, but with gratitude. Because now I knew I didn't need someone to complete me. I needed space to meet myself. On my birthday that year, I didn't hear from my family. No call, no message, but I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even hurt. I was surrounded by people who chose me without condition. Friends, mentees, mentors, and yes, even Nori, curled up by my feet as I blew out the single candle on my cake. That night, I walked out onto my balcony, looked out over the city, and whispered, "This is mine." Not the view, not the skyline, the peace. I had chased belonging my whole life, in approval, in obligation, in roles handed to me like chains disguised as crowns. But now, I wasn't chasing anymore. I was home. And for the first time, I wasn't sharing it with anyone who didn't know how to cherish it. The message arrived on a Friday afternoon. It was short, cold, and without explanation. Family meeting. Sunday, 5 p.m. Be on time. It came from my mother. No subject line, no greeting, not even a question mark. Just a summons, as though we were still playing by the old rules. For a moment, I stared at it, unsure whether to delete it or respond. I hadn't heard from any of them in nearly 5 months. After everything that had happened, after I had exposed the truth, cut the financial lifelines, and reclaimed my voice, I thought they had finally moved on, or at least accepted my absence. But something in me hesitated. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope. Maybe, despite everything, I still wanted to believe that people can change, that even after years of taking, someone might choose to give an apology, an acknowledgement, a gesture of truth. So I said nothing, but I booked a ticket back to Charleston. Not because I owed them anything, but because I needed to look them in the eyes one last time. Not for closure, but for clarity. When I arrived, the house looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had simply outgrown the frame they had placed me in for so long. The front steps creaked under my weight. The air was thick with the scent of gardenias, but it didn't comfort me. It felt like a memory I had long since left behind. Inside, the living room was dim. Eli and Caleb sat on the couch, arms crossed like mirror images, faces stiff with a kind of performative seriousness. My father stood by the fireplace, silent, his hands in his pockets. My mother sat in her usual chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes red as though she had been crying before I arrived. I waited for someone to speak. My mother was the first. "We don't understand what you're doing anymore, Isla," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and fatigue. "How far are you willing to go to tear this family apart?" I frowned, feeling my body harden against the accusation. "I'm not the one who tore anything apart," I said. "I just stopped pretending nothing was broken." My father stepped forward, his voice low and tired. "You've put us in serious financial trouble. Your mother's on the edge. If you keep holding this grudge, she's going to break." I stared at him. "So I'm responsible for her well-being now, too?" He didn't respond. Eli leaned forward, shaking his head. "You've got a good job, Isla. A whole new life. What's the big deal about helping your family? Isn't that what successful people do? Caleb added, "You're just paying the price for being selfish." Their words didn't sting like they used to. They didn't pierce or ignite the old shame. They just felt hollow, like a recording that had played too many times. I took a deep breath. "Do either of you remember when I helped pay off the second mortgage so Dad could retire early? Or when I stayed up 3 nights straight reworking Caleb's business proposal? Or how many times I paid your rent, Eli, even when you never paid me back?" They were silent. I turned to my mother. "Do you remember when I canceled my vacation to help with your medical bills? Or when I put off buying my first home to keep sending money to this house? Did that mean nothing to you?" Her eyes welled up. "You make everything about money," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "You do." The room fell silent. "I didn't come here to fight," I continued. "I came to say something I should have said a long time ago." I walked to the center of the room, standing between them like I had my whole life, mediating, fixing, explaining. But this time I wasn't going to bend. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you apologized, not because you earned it, but because I need to put down what I've been carrying. I need to let go of the version of me that believed if I gave enough, I would finally be enough." They looked stunned. Even Caleb seemed to shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I'm done," I said. "Not out of anger, not out of hate, but because I finally know that love shouldn't require me to disappear." I turned toward the door. No one moved to stop me. No one spoke. My heels clicked softly against the wood floor as I walked away from a life that had always asked too much and offered too little in return. When I stepped outside, the air hit me like a baptism, sharp, clean, final. I didn't cry. 2 days later, I returned to my apartment in Seattle. It was late when I arrived, the sky dark and soft, the city lights blinking in their familiar rhythm. I pulled my suitcase down the hall, humming a quiet song I didn't recognize. But when I reached my door, I stopped. Something wasn't right. There was foam again. Not as thick as before, just a fine trace along the edges of the doorframe. I froze. My stomach dropped. I pulled out my phone and accessed the building's security app. I fast-forwarded through the footage. And then, just like last time, there he was, Caleb. This time, his hood was down. No effort to hide. Just the same entitled smirk, the same spray can, the same arrogant confidence that there would be no consequences. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. The officers came. They reviewed the footage, took statements. When they asked if I wanted to press charges again, I didn't pause. "Yes," I said. "He doesn't get to do this again." Later that night, my phone rang. I let it ring. Then again. Then again. Finally, I answered. It was my father. His voice was tight, furious. "You had your brother arrested again. How could you do this to your own family?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just said, "He vandalized my home." Again. If he doesn't want to be arrested, he shouldn't commit crimes. Dad was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "What will it take to make this go away?" I said, $3,000 to cover the damage. Same as last time. "You're extorting your own brother?" "No," I said. "I'm enforcing boundaries." The next morning, the money appeared in my account. No note this time, just the transfer. And with that, the final bridge was burned. A few days later, I received messages from extended relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years. "Why are you doing this to your parents?" one asked. "You used to be such a good daughter." I didn't answer, but I noticed something strange. A new wave of comments and shares began popping up online. My mother had posted again, another long, performative message about how her daughter had turned against the family, how she and Ronald were now struggling, how their sons were doing their best to hold things together. There was no mention of the years I supported them, no mention of the police report, no mention of the pain they caused, just a narrative carefully spun to make themselves victims and me the villain. That night I sat with a glass of wine, staring out of the skyline. I didn't feel rage. I felt weary, like someone who had finally put down a burden they never should have been carrying. I opened my laptop, opened a new post, and I told the full story. Not just the money, but the silence, the manipulation, the vandalism, the police reports, the lies. And then I closed my laptop and went to bed. For the first time in a long time, I slept through the night, because the truth had a voice now, and it was mine. The silence that followed my final post didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the beginning of something I had never known before. There were no more calls, no more passive-aggressive texts, no late-night voicemails. It was as though my family had collectively decided I no longer existed. And strangely, that absence didn't hurt. It felt like walking out of a storm you never realized you were standing in for years. In the stillness, I could hear my own voice again. I spent the weeks that followed clearing my apartment of anything that anchored me to the life I had lived before. I donated old furniture, shredded financial statements, deleted voicemails I had kept out of guilt. I made space, both literal and emotional, for something new to grow, for a life built on intention, not obligation. I started painting again, just small watercolors at first. I wasn't trying to be good. I was just trying to be honest, with color, with silence, with myself. I bought a used record player from a vintage shop and spent weekends rediscovering music I had once loved but forgotten. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't rushing. I was learning to sit inside my own life and let it unfold. Then one morning in late summer, I received a job offer I hadn't expected. A National Financial Education Foundation reached out after reading my public post and asked if I would consider consulting on a new initiative for young women from underrepresented backgrounds. They didn't just want my expertise. They wanted my story, my lived experience, my voice. It was the first time in my life that someone saw the whole of me, my wounds, my knowledge, my resilience, and asked me to bring all of it into the room. I accepted. Soon, my work with Balance Forward expanded into workshops across the country. I spoke at universities and conferences, often to rooms full of women who had been told, like I once was, that giving endlessly made you good. I told them what no one had told me when I needed it most. Your worth is not measured by how much you can carry for other people. It is found in how gently you hold yourself. In early fall, I moved to Austin. It was a city I had always admired from afar, but never had the freedom to claim as my own. I bought a small house on the east side, nothing extravagant, but full of light. The first morning I woke up there, I made coffee barefoot and stood on my back porch, watching the sun rise over the rooftops. I felt no rush to be anywhere, no fear of what might be waiting in my inbox, no pressure to solve someone else's emergency. For the first time, I was allowed to begin again on my terms. That December, I hosted a small holiday gathering. No family, no strained reunions. Just friends, neighbors, and a few women from my mentorship group. Maddie, my cousin, the only family member who had ever stood quietly by my side, arrived early with a tray of her famous cinnamon rolls and a soft hug that didn't ask anything of me. "I'm proud of you, Isla," she said, as we stood side by side stringing lights around my front window. "Not just for speaking up, but for choosing yourself." Her words settled into me like a truth I had always known, but never allowed myself to believe. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't need to win anyone back. I was no longer a daughter defined by debt. I was a woman rebuilding her life on trust, choice, and joy. We ate, we laughed, we exchanged stories and songs. When midnight struck, I stood on the balcony, a glass of champagne in my hand, looking at the twinkling city skyline. I closed my eyes and whispered a simple promise to myself. No more invisible burdens. No more shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. No more waiting for love that needed to be earned. In the weeks that followed, I fell into a rhythm that felt like peace. Morning runs by the river, long hours in sunlit cafes drafting curriculum for the next wave of Balance Forward leaders. Quiet dinners with people who knew how to listen without taking. And then, one morning in February, I received a letter. It was from my father. The handwriting was careful, as though he had taken his time. The message was short. He didn't apologize directly, but he acknowledged that things had been unfair, that they hadn't truly understood what they had asked of me, that he wasn't proud of how things ended, but that he hoped I had found happiness. There was no manipulation in his words, just a quiet, incomplete truth. I didn't write back, not because I was angry, but because I didn't need the last word anymore. I had found peace in the space between silence and forgiveness, in letting go without erasing the past, in choosing my future without rewriting theirs, and in the most unexpected way, the absence of their presence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a healed scar, evidence of something survived, not something broken. That spring, I was invited to speak in Florence, Italy, at a global women's empowerment summit. It was hosted in a historic villa just outside the city, overlooking olive groves and sun-soaked hills. The irony wasn't lost on me. Italy had once been the symbol of everything I gave up for my family. Now, it was the reward for everything I had reclaimed. As I walked through the cobblestone streets of Florence on my first day, I thought about that first dinner in Charleston. How one conversation, one moment of betrayal, had shattered the version of me that had been trying to hold everyone together. How that pain, as brutal as it was, had forced me to face the truth, that I had never really been seen. And yet, in the breaking, I found myself. In Florence, I visited cathedrals older than any memory I carried. I ate meals that stretched for hours, not minutes. I sat in open piazzas watching children play and old couples hold hands. I felt time expand. And I remembered something I had read once, that freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the presence of joy. On the final night of the summit, as I stood on stage beneath soft golden lights, I told my story. I spoke not as a daughter or a martyr or a cautionary tale, but as a whole person who had once believed that love was something to be earned through sacrifice. And I told them what I had come to believe. That family is not just the people who share your name. It is the people who hold your name with care, who see your needs and honor your boundaries, who understand that love isn't something to be bought or bartered. It's something to be given freely without agenda. Afterward, a woman in her 60s came up to me in tears. She hugged me and said, "You said everything I've carried for 40 years." In that moment, I knew I had done something real, something lasting. I wasn't just healing for myself anymore. I was creating space for others to do the same. Back in Austin, life settled again into quiet beauty. I planted a small garden in my backyard. Lavender, rosemary, tomatoes. I started writing a book about everything I had learned. I gave Nori her own spot on the porch where she could sunbathe all morning. And some evenings I sat out there too, just watching the sky shift. No noise, no drama, no proving, just presence. My phone doesn't ring anymore with guilt-laced demands. My email isn't filled with passive judgment. My heart doesn't brace for the next betrayal. Instead, I wake up with the knowledge that I'm no longer surviving. I am living. And that is the quiet revolution of choosing yourself, not in rebellion, but in reverence, not in exile, but in liberation, not in anger, but in love, a love that finally and fully includes me. Looking back on Isla's story, it's impossible not to see how many invisible battles she fought just to survive within her own family. What began as a quiet sacrifice, small at first, like covering a late phone bill or helping out with groceries, grew into a system of dependency built entirely on her shoulders. It was subtle at first. There were no ultimatums, just unspoken expectations. Then came the obligations disguised as love and the manipulations framed as loyalty. Over time, she wasn't just the oldest child or the successful sister. She became the provider, the crutch, the one who was expected to stretch beyond human limits to keep everyone else afloat. And yet, she did it. Isla did what so many of us do without acknowledgement. She gave. She gave money, time, emotional labor, years of her life, and countless dreams she put on hold in order to keep the family together. And she did it not because she wanted control or credit. She did it because she believed love looked like sacrifice, that if she gave enough, did enough, carried enough, one day they would see her, appreciate her, choose her. But they didn't. Instead, they wrote her out of the will, not out of cruelty, but out of calculation. They didn't see her sacrifices as love. They saw them as transactions, predictable, convenient. And when she stopped, they didn't ask why. They didn't reach out and care. They retaliated. First with silence, then with social shame, then with vandalism and threats. And that's when Isla realized something life-changing. Love that only exists when you're giving isn't love at all. It's conditional servitude. From that moment forward, her life didn't change overnight. It changed choice by choice, canceling the payments, speaking the truth publicly, enforcing boundaries even when it meant police involvement, turning down guilt and reclaiming time. She started therapy, she listened to her inner voice, she traveled, she built new relationships rooted not in need but in mutual respect. She created balance forward, mentoring women like her who had been taught to disappear inside family roles. Her growth wasn't linear. She grieved. She doubted. But she didn't go back. And that was the breakthrough. Because sometimes the greatest act of healing isn't forgiveness. It's distance. Sometimes family isn't who raised you, but who respects you. Sometimes love means leaving. Through it all, Isla learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors. Doors you open to the right people and close to those who have proven they won't protect your peace. She learned that freedom isn't selfish, it's sacred, and that survival is not the same as living. She left behind the title of the strong one because it was never a compliment, it was a warning. A way of saying, you can endure pain, so we'll give you more. But in the end, Isla didn't just walk away, she walked toward a life of authenticity, toward creativity, toward connection that didn't come with strings, toward mornings where she didn't wake up to panic, toward nights where silence wasn't suffocating, but soothing. Her story isn't rare. That's what makes it powerful. Because for every Isla, there are thousands more. Men and women who have quietly carried their families for years, who are afraid to stop because they've been told their worth is tied to what they give. People who haven't had a chance to ask themselves, what do I want if no one needs me? Isla's journey reminds us that it's okay to walk away when staying means losing yourself. It reminds us that peace isn't found through pleasing others. It's found through honoring yourself. And it teaches us one of the most important lessons of all. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by behavior. You are allowed to outgrow people, even if they share your last name. You are allowed to say no, even if they call you selfish. You are allowed to choose joy over duty, and you are allowed to start again, at any age, on your own terms. And if you've been waiting for permission to do so, consider Isla's story the green light. Now, imagine you're in Isla's shoes. Your family has come to rely on you emotionally, financially, even spiritually, but you're drained. You feel invisible, and suddenly you see it clearly. The dynamic isn't healthy, and it's never going to change unless you do something. What would you do? Would you A, stay, continue supporting them, and hope one day they will appreciate and return the care you've given for years? Or B, begin stepping back, create boundaries, and slowly redirect that care and compassion toward yourself, knowing they may never understand your reasons? Share your answer in the comments by typing A or B. There's no judgment, only reflection. Your response could help someone else feel less alone. As we continue sharing these stories, we want to know, what do you think about Isla's journey? Does it remind you of someone in your life? Have you ever been the one who held everything together? Comment below with your thoughts so others can learn from your insight. And if this story resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling real stories that challenge, heal, and inspire. We're just getting started. Let's keep growing together.